My name is Amelia, and last Saturday, my parents drew a line in the sand of our family, not with a stick, but with a slammed door in the faces of my two children. They stood on my parents' immaculate porch, two small figures shivering in the crisp New England autumn air, utterly bewildered. My son, Liam, who is 10 and carries the world's worries in his thoughtful eyes, just stared at the polished oak door, his hand still half raised as if he was about to knock again. My 7-year-old Chloe, whose spirit is usually as bright as her fiery red hair, crumpled against me, her small sobs muffled by my coat. Through the leaded glass window, I could see them. My mother, Eleanor, turning away with a look of grim satisfaction, and my father, Richard, already moving back towards the living room, his shoulders set, with the unshakable certainty of a man who has never once questioned his own judgment. The reason for this sudden, brutal eviction? A broken toy. Not just any toy, of course. It was a limited edition, remote-controlled Batmobile that belonged to my nephew, Asher, their golden grandchild. But as I held my weeping daughter and tried to find words for my stunned son, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. This wasn't about a toy. This was the culmination of a lifetime of being second best, of being the afterthought, the lesser daughter whose children were merely footnotes in the grand saga of their perfect son and his perfect heir. They had just kicked my children out of the house they believed was their fortress, their legacy. But they didn't know the truth about the ground beneath their feet, about the very foundation they stood upon. They had no idea that the storm they had just unleashed was about to circle back and tear their world apart from the inside out. Before I tell you about the secret I'd been keeping for almost 5 years, a secret my own grandfather entrusted to me, do me a favor. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, if you know what it's like to fight for a place at a table that should have been set for you from the start, hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to hear how this ends. And drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It's comforting to know I'm not alone in this. To understand the sheer cruelty of that moment on the porch, you have to understand the geography of my family. We weren't just a family, we were a dynasty in our own minds, ruled from the ancestral throne of a sprawling colonial estate in a wealthy Boston suburb. The house wasn't just wood and brick. It was a symbol. It was where my grandfather built his engineering firm, where my father took it over, and where my brother, Ethan, the crown prince, was being groomed to continue the legacy. Ethan was 2 years older, effortlessly charming, and successful in the exact way my parents valued. Loud, flashy, and profitable. He was in finance, a world of sharp suits and calculated risks that my father, a rigid and traditional man, both admired and envied. My husband, Mark, is a high school history teacher, a good man, a brilliant educator who molds young minds with patience and passion. To my parents, he might as well be a peasant. They saw his steady, quiet dedication not as a virtue, but as a lack of ambition. A teacher's salary, my father would say with a dismissive sniff, as if the words themselves left a bad taste in his mouth. Consequently, my children, Liam and Chloe, were viewed through that same distorted lens. They were the offspring of the lesser daughter and the unambitious teacher. They were polite, creative, and kind. But those qualities were invisible to my parents. They were looking for pedigree, for a reflection of their own perceived greatness, and they found it in Asher. Asher, Ethan's son, was a difficult child. That's the kindest way to put it. He was a whirlwind of entitlement, raised to believe that the world was his personal playground and that every object in it was his to claim or destroy. But in my parents' eyes, his tantrums were signs of a strong will, his possessiveness a mark of a future leader. When Liam would spend an hour meticulously building a complex Lego castle, my father would glance at it and grunt. When Asher would smash that same castle to pieces a minute later, my father would chuckle and say, "That's my boy. Knows how to make an entrance." The incident with the Batmobile was a perfect storm of this dynamic. We'd gone over for an early Thanksgiving dinner. The kids were relegated to the basement playroom, a space overflowing with every expensive toy a child could dream of, all belonging to Asher. Chloe, in a rare moment of being allowed to touch one of the sacred relics, had been driving the Batmobile. According to Liam, who recounted the story with the solemn accuracy of a courtroom witness, Asher had snatched the remote from her hands. They tussled. Chloe tripped, and the remote flew from her grasp, cracking on the stone hearth. The car itself was untouched, but the controller was broken. The fallout was immediate and biblical. Asher's shrieks brought my parents running. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't listen to Liam's attempts to explain. They saw Chloe's frightened face, Asher's performative tears, and the broken remote. The verdict was instantaneous. "She did it on purpose," Eleanor declared, her voice laced with ice. "She's always been jealous of him." My father pointed a trembling finger toward the stairs. "Get them out," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I will not have destructive, ill-mannered children in this house. This is a place of respect." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Respect. As I was herding my terrified kids towards the door, my brother Ethan simply smirked from the doorway, a silent endorsement of the verdict. He watched me gather their coats, his eyes cold and triumphant. It was a team effort. The family had closed ranks, and my children and I were on the outside. As I buckled them into their car seats, their faces streaked with tears and confusion, I looked back at the grand house, lit up against the twilight sky. It looked so permanent, so solid, a fortress of family pride. They thought they were the kings and queen of that castle. They had no idea that a quiet, underestimated history teacher's wife held the deed. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick with the unspoken questions and the crushing weight of rejection. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, my heart aching with every look. Liam was staring out the window, his jaw tight, his 10-year-old face set in a stoic mask that was far too old for him. He was trying to be the man of the family, to be strong for his sister, and the effort was heartbreaking. Chloe had cried herself into a state of hiccuping exhaustion in her car seat, her little hand clutching a crumpled tissue. Every so often, a shudder would run through her small body. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that her grandparents, the people who are supposed to love her unconditionally, could be so cruel? How do you tell her that her crime wasn't breaking a toy, but simply being born to the wrong parents? I couldn't find the words. The usual platitudes, "It's okay, honey." They didn't mean it felt like lies, and my children deserved better than lies. So I just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to rest on Chloe's knee, hoping the simple touch could convey what words could not. "You are safe. You are loved. I am here." When we pulled into our own driveway, the contrast was staggering. Our home is a modest 2-story house with a slightly crooked porch swing and a lawn that's more dandelions than grass. It's a home filled with mismatched furniture, finger paintings taped to the fridge, and the beautiful, chaotic symphony of a life lived with love, not for appearances. Mark's car was already there, and as we walked in, the warm smell of garlic bread and tomato sauce wrapped around us like a hug. He was in the kitchen, a dish towel slung over his shoulder, humming along to the radio. The moment he saw our faces, the smile vanished. "Ames? What's wrong? What happened?" he asked, his voice instantly laced with concern as he knelt to Chloe's level. That's when the dam broke. Chloe launched herself into his arms, and the story came tumbling out in a torrent of sobs and fragmented sentences. "Asher! The car!" Grandpa yelled. "Grandma was mad. They told us to leave." Liam stood silently by the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, but I could see the sheen of tears in his eyes before he quickly wiped them away and turned his head. Mark just held Chloe, stroking her hair, his eyes meeting mine over her head. In his gaze, I saw a mirror of my own pain, but also a simmering, protective anger that was entirely on my family's behalf. He didn't need to hear my side of it. He knew. He had seen the subtle digs, the backhanded compliments, the dismissive attitudes for years. He had always been my staunchest defender, the one who would tell me I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt, the one who reminded me of my own worth when my family tried to strip it away. Later that night, after we'd tucked the kids into bed, a process that took twice as long as usual, filled with extra stories, back rubs, and quiet assurances that they were the best kids in the entire world. Mark and I sat in the dim light of the living room. He poured us both a generous glass of wine. "I could kill him," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your father. To do that to them, Amelia. To our kids. Over a piece of plastic." I just nodded, tracing the rim of my glass. "It was never about the plastic, Mark. It was a power play. It was about reminding me of my place." He reached across the small coffee table and took my hand. "Then it's time we changed the rules of the game," he said firmly. "This isn't just about you anymore. They hurt our children. That's a line they don't get to cross and walk away from." His words echoed a sentiment that had been solidifying in my own heart. For years I had absorbed the slights, swallowed the hurt, and made excuses for their behavior. Dad's just stressed. Mom doesn't mean it that way. Ethan has always been competitive. But watching my children suffer for the crime of being mine had cauterized that part of me forever. The part that craved their approval was gone, replaced by the fierce, unyielding instinct of a mother protecting her cubs. As I sat there, I thought of my grandfather, Henry. He was my father's father, but they were cut from entirely different cloths. Where my father was rigid and obsessed with appearances, my grandfather was kind, perceptive, and valued integrity above all else. He was the one who had seen me. He taught me how to read financial statements when I was a teenager, not because he wanted me in the family business, but because he'd said, "A smart woman should always know how to read the map of money, Amelia. It'll keep you independent." He'd passed away 5 years ago, and his loss still felt like a raw, open wound. Before he died, during one of our last lucid conversations, he had given me a heavy, old-fashioned key to a safe deposit box. "Don't open this unless you find yourself in a time of great family crisis," he had warned, his voice thin but his eyes sharp. "I mean a real crisis, Amelia. When you feel like the foundation is crumbling, this will either be the rock you can stand on, or the stone you must use to rebuild." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic, perhaps a side effect of his medication. I had put the key in my jewelry box and mostly forgotten about it. But now, sitting in the quiet of my living room, his words came back to me with chilling clarity. A time of great family crisis. When you feel like the foundation is crumbling, the foundation hadn't just crumbled, my parents had taken a sledgehammer to it. And as Mark squeezed my hand, I knew. It was time to open the box. It was time to see what stone my grandfather had left for me. The next morning, I woke up with a resolve that felt like a steel rod in my spine. The hurt was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but it was being rapidly overshadowed by a cold, clear-eyed fury. I had spent years walking on eggshells, carefully navigating the minefield of my family's fragile egos, all for nothing. My compliance hadn't earned me respect. It had only taught them that I was a doormat. The phone call came around 10 o'clock, just as I knew it would. It was my mother, Eleanor. Her tone wasn't apologetic. It was imperial, as if she were a queen addressing a disobedient subject. "Amelia," she began, without any preamble, "I trust you've had time to reflect on the children's appalling behavior yesterday." I took a deep breath, holding the phone away from my ear for a moment, to stare at it in disbelief. "Reflect? Mom?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Are you calling to apologize?" A short, sharp laugh echoed down the line. "Apologize? For what? For maintaining standards in my own home?" "I'm calling because your father and I have discussed the matter, and we expect you to do 2 things. First, you will make Chloe and Liam write a formal letter of apology to Asher and to us. Second, you will replace the toy, and not with some cheap knockoff. Ethan sent me the link. The replacement for that specific model is $450. You will have it shipped directly to the house. I was speechless. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. They had traumatized my children, thrown them out of their home, and now they were presenting me with a bill and a list of demands. No, I said. Just that one word. Quiet but absolute. The silence on the other end of the line was frigid. "What did you just say to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I said, "No, Mom. I will not be forcing my children to apologize for an accident that was instigated by their cousin, and I will not be buying a $400 toy to replace a broken remote that probably costs $50 to fix. In fact, I will not be doing anything you've asked. You are being incredibly disrespectful, Amelia," she hissed. "After everything we've done for you, what have you done for me?" I cut her off, the question sharp and genuine. "What have you ever done for me, or my family, that didn't come with strings attached or a heavy dose of judgment?" She sputtered, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "This is your brother's family you're disrespecting. Ethan is very upset." "Oh, I'm sure he is," I said dryly. "It must be exhausting having to parent a child who has never been told the word no." Before she could respond, I ended the call. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was from adrenaline. It was the exhilarating, terrifying feeling of setting a boundary for the very first time. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Ethan. If my mother's approach was the cold fury of a matriarch, Ethan's was the slick, condescending lecture of a man who believed he was intellectually superior to everyone in the room. "Ames," he said, using the diminutive nickname I loathed. "Mom told me about your little chat. You're really going to blow up the family over a toy?" "This isn't about a toy, Ethan, and you know it," I retorted. "This is about the fact that our parents treat your son like a prince and my kids like dirt." He sighed, a theatrical sound of weary patience. "Look, I get it. Mark doesn't make what I make. Your life is quieter. It's natural to feel a little resentment, but you can't let that jealousy spill over onto the kids. Asher is sensitive. That toy meant a lot to him. You need to make this right, for the good of the family." The condescension dripped from every word. The casual insult to my husband, the psychoanalysis of my supposed jealousy, it was his classic playbook. He was trying to frame me as the irrational, emotional one, while he was the calm, logical peacemaker. "The only thing I need to do, Ethan, is protect my children from a toxic environment," I said, my voice hardening. "You should try it sometime. Maybe teach Asher that the world doesn't revolve around him and that actions have consequences." "Consequences?" He laughed, a short, barking sound. "What consequences are you talking about? Mom and Dad are cutting you off. You realize that, right? No more holidays at the house, no more family functions. You're on the outside looking in. Is that what you want for your kids?" The threat was clear. Conform, or be excommunicated. For my entire life, that threat had been my own personal boogeyman. The fear of being cast out, of being truly alone, had kept me silent and obedient. But as he spoke, I realized something profound. I was already on the outside. They had put me there years ago. The only difference was that now the door was locked, and I was no longer knocking, begging to be let in. "Thank you for clarifying, Ethan," I said, a strange sense of peace settling over me. "It's good to know where everyone stands." I hung up before he could say another word. That was it. The final straw. The lines had been drawn, the allegiances declared. My own mother and brother had, in the span of 2 hours, confirmed that their love was conditional, transactional, and had nothing to do with me and everything to do with my compliance. As I stood in my kitchen, the morning sun streaming in, I felt a chapter of my life slam shut. The Amelia who yearned for her parents' approval was gone. The woman standing there now was someone new. She was a mother, a wife, and the keeper of a very old key. I walked into my bedroom, straight to the antique jewelry box on my dresser. I pushed aside necklaces and earrings until my fingers closed around the cold, heavy brass key. It felt solid, real, a tangible link to the one man in my family who had ever truly believed in me. A time of great family crisis. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. This was it. I grabbed my purse, my car keys, and the brass key. It was time to go to the bank. It was time to unlock the past and, with it, the future. The bank was one of those old, imposing downtown buildings with marble columns and floors that clicked authoritatively under your heels. It felt like a place where secrets were kept, which seemed fitting. I hadn't been to this particular branch in years, not since my grandfather had first set up the safe deposit box. The process felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. The bank manager, a prim woman named Mrs. Gable, verified my identity, and the key with a solemnity reserved for state funerals. She led me through a heavy vault door into a quiet, sterile room lined with gleaming metal boxes. My box was near the bottom, number 316, Mrs. Gable used her key, then mine, and with a soft clunk, the small door opened. She slid out a long, surprisingly heavy metal box and placed it on the table in a private viewing cubicle before leaving me alone with a polite, "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Anderson." I sat there for a full minute, just staring at the box. It was cold to the touch. This was it, the rock or the stone my grandfather had spoken of. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. The contents were simple, not the treasure trove of stocks or bonds I might have imagined. On top lay a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name, Amelia, written in my grandfather's spidery but elegant script. Beneath it was a formidable-looking legal binder, easily 2 inches thick, held together by brass clasps. I picked up the letter first. The paper felt crisp, timeless. I broke the wax seal, which was stamped with his initial H for Henry, and unfolded the pages. The letter began, and as I read, it was as if he were in the room with me, his calm, steady voice narrating the words on the page. "My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and the family has likely pushed you to a place I always feared they would. I hope I am wrong. I hope you are reading this decades from now out of simple curiosity. But in my heart, I know your father. I know his pride, and I know how he, your mother, and your brother see the world. And, my dear, I know they have never truly seen you." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away, forcing myself to continue. "I need to tell you a story, a piece of family history your father has gone to great lengths to bury. 20 years ago, long before Mark was in the picture, your father's ambition outpaced his wisdom. He made a series of disastrous investments in a commercial real estate venture. He leveraged everything, including the house. The market turned, the venture collapsed, and he was on the verge of not just bankruptcy, but foreclosure. The bank was going to take the home that has been in our family for 3 generations. He was a broken man, full of shame and terror. He never told anyone, not even your mother, the full extent of the crisis. He came to me, his last resort. I bailed him out, Amelia, but not by simply giving him the money. That would have taught him nothing. Instead, I paid off the bank myself and quietly purchased the house from him for the exact amount of his debt, a fraction of its true value. I became the legal owner of the property at 212 Hickory Lane. He signed the deed over to me, and in return, I allowed him and your mother to live there for the rest of their lives under the assumption that they were the owners. It was an arrangement born of his shame and my desire to preserve the family's dignity. He has a deed in his files, but it's a copy, one I let him keep so he could maintain the illusion of ownership. The original, the true deed, is in this box." My breath hitched in my chest. I glanced at the legal binder. It all started to click into place. But I knew that wasn't a permanent solution. What would happen after I was gone? I could not leave the property to your father in my will. His pride would never allow him to accept it as a gift, and I feared he might be reckless with it again. I could not leave it to Ethan, for he shares your father's temperament without his underlying work ethic. So, I created a different solution. I established the Hickory Lane Revocable Trust. The sole asset of this trust is the house and the land it sits on. And, my dear Amelia, you are its sole trustee. I dropped the letter onto the table, my mind reeling. I picked it up again, my eyes scanning the last paragraphs frantically. This means you, and you alone, control the property. Your father and mother are, in legal terms, tenants. They have lived there for years without a lease, without paying rent, because I allowed it. As trustee, that power now passes to you. You can continue my arrangement, you can draw up a formal lease, or you can sell the property and use the funds as you see fit. The power is yours. I know this is a heavy burden, but I am not giving you a weapon for revenge. I am giving you a shield for protection. I am giving you leverage, a seat at the table they have never offered you. You have a good heart, Amelia, but you also have a spine of steel, even if you don't always know it. Use this power with wisdom. Protect yourself. Protect your wonderful children. Know your worth, my girl. You are always the smartest and the strongest of them all. All my love. Grandpa Henry. I put the letter down, my whole body trembling. It wasn't just a shock, it was a fundamental rewriting of my entire reality. The house, the seat of my family's power, the source of their unshakable entitlement, the very place they had banished my children from, was mine. The irony was so profound, so devastatingly perfect, it was almost poetic. I slowly opened the legal binder. It was all there. The original deed with my grandfather's name, the formation documents for the trust, and the legal papers designating me, Amelia Rose Anderson, as the sole successor trustee. It was ironclad. I sat in that sterile, quiet cubicle for what felt like an eternity, the weight of it all settling over me. This was so much bigger than a broken toy. This was about decades of buried secrets, of carefully constructed lies, and of a grandfather's incredible foresight. He had seen this day coming. He knew that one day my family's pride and prejudice would force me into a corner, and he had left me the one tool I needed to not just escape, but to dismantle the corner itself. I thought about Mark's words from the night before. It's time we changed the rules of the game. I started to laugh. A real, genuine laugh that echoed in the silent vault. My grandfather hadn't just given me a way to change the rules. He had just made me the owner of the entire game board. The question now was, what was my first move? I left the bank feeling like a different person. The world outside seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. The weight in my chest had been replaced by a powerful, thrumming energy. It wasn't the giddy thrill of revenge, not yet. It was the electrifying feeling of empowerment, of seeing a clear path forward after a lifetime of walking through fog. I drove not home, but to a small, unassuming brick building in the city's historic district. The brass plaque on the door read, Hemlock and Associates, Attorneys at Law. Mr. Alistair Hemlock had been my grandfather's lawyer and friend for over 40 years. He was a man who seemed to be woven from tweed, old books, and quiet integrity. If anyone could help me navigate this, it was him. He greeted me with a warm, wrinkled smile, his sharp blue eyes full of a knowing sadness. Amelia, he said, ushering me into his office, which smelled of leather and lemon polish. I have been wondering when I might receive a visit from you. Your grandfather was very specific about the documents in that box. I placed the legal binder on his large mahogany desk. He told me you would know what to do. Mr. Hemlock put on a pair of reading glasses and spent the next 30 minutes poring over the trust documents, nodding occasionally. The silence was comfortable, professional. Finally, he looked up at me over the rims of his glasses. Everything is precisely as Henry and I designed it, he confirmed. The Hickory Lane Trust is the undisputed legal owner of the property. You, as the successor trustee, have complete authority over said property. Your father's name is not on the deed, nor has it been for 20 years. Legally speaking, he and your mother are tenants at will. They have no lease and therefore very few rights. He leaned back in his chair. Henry was a brilliant engineer, but he was also a master strategist. He saw your father's financial vulnerabilities and, shall we say, his character flaws. He created this trust not just to save the house, but to create a system of checks and balances for the family's future. He put his faith in you, Amelia. Hearing it stated so plainly by a man of the law solidified it in my mind. So what are my options? I asked, my voice steady. Legally? He steepled his fingers. Your options are broad. You could begin eviction proceedings tomorrow, citing that you, the owner, wish to reclaim the property. It would be messy and public, but you would win. You could sell the house from under them, providing them with legal notice, of course. The proceeds would belong entirely to the trust, that is, to you. Or you could choose to formalize their tenancy. What does that mean? I asked, leaning forward. It means you could treat them as you would any other tenants. You could draw up a lease agreement with specific terms, conditions, and, of course, rent. Rent. The word hung in the air, glittering with possibility. The thought of my father, a man who measured worth in dollars and cents, having to write a rent check to an entity I controlled was a form of justice so poetic it made my head spin. But my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. I am not giving you a weapon for revenge. I am giving you a shield for protection. He was right. A full frontal assault, an eviction, would be needlessly destructive. It would burn the last bridge and likely traumatize my parents in a way that felt cruel, not just, but doing nothing was no longer an option. I needed to protect my children and my own sanity. I needed to establish a boundary so clear and so strong that they would never even think of crossing it again. And that's when the plan began to form. Not a fiery explosion of revenge, but a slow, methodical tightening of a screw. A plan that would use their own language of money, rules, and consequences against them. Mr. Hemlock, I said, a new confidence in my voice. I don't want to evict them. Not yet. I want to formalize their tenancy, but I want to do it anonymously. His eyebrows shot up in interest. Go on. I want to create a property management LLC, I explained, the idea taking shape as I spoke. Something with a generic, official-sounding name. This LLC, acting on behalf of the Hickory Lane Trust, will be the new manager of the property. It will communicate with my parents, enforce the rules, and collect the fees. They can't know it's me. They need to believe this is an impersonal, bureaucratic force they can't bully or emotionally manipulate. A slow smile spread across Mr. Hemlock's face. Oh, Henry would have loved this, he chuckled. It's brilliant, Amelia. It removes the personal element and forces them to confront the situation on its legal merits alone. We can have an LLC set up in a matter of days. Hickory Lane Properties has a nice, sturdy ring to it, don't you think? Perfect, I said. And what about rent? I don't want to gouge them. I want this to be about principle, not profit. We can frame it not as rent, but as a monthly property maintenance and tax fee, he suggested. We'll calculate the exact amount needed to cover the property taxes, insurance, and a fund for necessary repairs, things your father has likely been neglecting, if I know him. It will be a fair market rate, legally justifiable, but high enough to be a significant financial burden for them. It will force them to reckon with the actual cost of their lifestyle. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. It wasn't a sledgehammer. It was a slow, rising tide. They wouldn't be homeless, but their sense of untouchable ownership would be stripped away. The castle they had banished my children from would suddenly have a landlord who would be enforcing rules. And the first rule would be about respect for all family members. We'll need to send them an official letter, I said, my mind racing ahead, informing them of the change in management, outlining the new fee structure, and scheduling a mandatory property inspection. An inspection? Mr. Hemlock grinned. Oh, that's a lovely touch. Documenting the state of the property. Very professional. Very intimidating. As I left his office, the legal binder tucked safely in my bag and the plan firmly in place, I felt a sense of profound calm. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was taking control. I was honoring my grandfather's legacy, not by wielding my power like a sword, but by using it as a finely tuned instrument to recalibrate the broken dynamics of my family. They had wanted to teach my children a lesson about consequences. They had no idea about the lesson they were about to learn themselves. They had slammed a door in my children's faces. I was about to, politely, professionally, and legally inform them that I owned the entire house. The following Tuesday, the first shot was fired. It wasn't a cannonball, but a crisp, professionally printed letter on heavy bond paper, delivered by certified mail. The envelope bore the return address of Hickory Lane Properties, LLC, with a post office box in downtown Boston. Inside, the letter was polite, bureaucratic, and utterly chilling in its impersonality. I knew its contents by heart, Mr. Hemlock and I had drafted it together. It began with a formal salutation to the current occupants of 212 Hickory Lane. It went on to explain that, as per the governing documents of the Hickory Lane Revocable Trust, the legal owner of the property, Hickory Lane Properties, LLC, had been appointed to oversee and manage the estate effective immediately. It detailed the new monthly property maintenance and tax fee, which we had calculated to be a rather steep $3,500 due on the first of every month, beginning in 2 weeks. It explained that this fee was non-negotiable and was required to cover the significant costs of property taxes, homeowners' insurance, and a capital fund for long overdue maintenance. Finally, it informed them that a mandatory inspection of the property would be conducted by a company representative in 10 days' time to assess the current condition of the home and identify any areas of neglect or tenant-caused damage. The letter was signed by a Mr. Davies, a junior associate at Mr. Hemlock's firm, who had agreed to be the faceless voice of the LLC. I spent that entire Tuesday in a state of nervous anticipation, my phone clutched in my hand. I imagined the scene at my parents' house, the mail arriving, my mother sorting through it, the confusion, the dawning horror as my father read the letter. The call came at 6:15 p.m., just as I was helping Chloe with her homework. The caller ID read Richard Hathaway, my father. I let it ring twice, took a deep breath, and answered with a calm, "Hello? Amelia!" The roar on the other end of the line was so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. What is the meaning of this? This letter? Some sham company claiming they manage the house? This is harassment. It's fraud. I let him vent, his voice a torrent of outrage and disbelief. I pictured him in his study, the letter trembling in his hand, his face red with indignation. His entire world, built on the foundation of his perceived ownership and authority, had just been shaken to its core. "Dad, calm down," I said, injecting a note of feigned concern into my voice. "What are you talking about? What letter? Don't play dumb with me," he bellowed. "A letter from Hickory Lane Properties. They're demanding $3,500 a month. They say they own the house. It's ludicrous. This is my house. My father left it to me." Here it was, the lie he had told himself and everyone else for 20 years. The lie my grandfather had allowed him to tell to save his pride. "Dad, that doesn't make any sense," I said, playing my part. "There must be some mistake. A scam, maybe? Did you check the records at the county clerk's office?" "Of course I haven't checked the records," he sputtered. "I don't need to. I have the deed right here in my safe." He was so confident, so utterly sure of his position. He had no idea the paper he was holding was essentially a historical document, rendered meaningless 2 decades ago. "Well, that's just bizarre," I said, letting a note of sympathy creep in. "I can't imagine what that's about. Is there anything I can do?" His tone shifted slightly, from pure rage to commanding entitlement. "Yes, you can do something. Your husband has summers off. He's got time on his hands. Have him go down to the city records office tomorrow and sort this out. and call your brother. Ethan knows people. He'll have his lawyers all over this by morning. We need to shut this down. And fast. I want these people sued into oblivion for this. The irony was delicious. He was ordering me, the secret architect of his problem, to deploy my family to solve it for him. He was so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't see the truth, even if it was staring him right in the face. Okay, Dad, I said soothingly. I'll talk to Mark and Ethan. I'm sure it's all just a big misunderstanding. I hung up the phone, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. The first domino had fallen. He was rattled, but still convinced he was in the right. He believed he was the victim of an external attack, a bureaucratic error. The thought that the challenge was coming from within his own family, from the daughter he had dismissed and disrespected, was so far outside his realm of possibility that it simply didn't exist. He had dispatched his lieutenants, his favored son, and his lesser daughter's unambitious husband to fight a battle for him. He had no idea they were walking into an ambush I had meticulously planned. The next 10 days were going to be very, very interesting. The countdown to the property inspection had begun, and with it, the systematic dismantling of my father's kingdom, one bureaucratic, legally binding letter at a time. He thought he was fighting a faceless corporation. He was about to find out he was fighting a ghost from his past and a daughter he had fatally underestimated. The days that followed my father's explosive phone call were a masterclass in controlled chaos, all orchestrated from the quiet of my kitchen table. Just as my father had demanded, Ethan sprang into action, full of bluster and arrogance. He called me the next morning. "Don't worry, Ames," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've got my top guys on this. We'll have this Hickory Lane Properties nonsense cleared up in 48 hours. Probably some bottom-feeding company that got the public records mixed up. Dad is overreacting, as usual." I murmured my thanks, playing the role of the grateful, clueless little sister. "Oh, thank you, Ethan. He's just so stressed about it." "Yeah, well, that's what I'm here for," he said magnanimously. "To handle the real problems." The best part was the call Ethan made to Hickory Lane Properties. Mr. Hemlock had briefed his junior associate, the mild-mannered Mr. Davies, who was more than prepared. Ethan, accustomed to bullying and intimidating his way to what he wanted, was met with a calm, unshakable wall of bureaucratic politeness. Mr. Davies simply kept repeating, "I'm sorry, sir, but our records are quite clear. The property at 212 Hickory Lane is owned by the Hickory Lane Revocable Trust. We are the legally appointed managers. If you have a dispute, you'll need to take it up with the trustees." When Ethan demanded to know who the trustees were, Mr. Davies calmly replied, "That information is confidential, protected by attorney-client privilege. Now, if there's nothing else, I have another call." Ethan was left sputtering into a dead phone line, his power and influence utterly useless against an opponent who refused to even acknowledge his importance. Meanwhile, my father, impatient and furious, took matters into his own hands. He drove down to the county records office himself, chest puffed out, ready to put some paper-pushing clerk in their place. I would have paid $1,000 to be a fly on the wall for that moment. The moment the clerk pulled up the digital file for his address and showed him the screen. The moment he saw the most recent deed of sale, dated 20 years ago, listing the buyer as Henry Hathaway. And the subsequent document, transferring the property into the Hickory Lane Revocable Trust, the clerk probably then showed him that his own deed, the one he kept in his safe, had never been officially recorded as the most recent transfer of ownership. It was, in the eyes of the state, a historical footnote. He didn't call me after that. The silence was more telling than any angry outburst could have been. He must have locked himself in his study, the gears in his mind grinding, trying to make sense of the impossible. He would have remembered the bailout from my grandfather, but he had rewritten that history in his mind as a simple loan he had long since repaid, not as the complete surrender of his home. His entire identity was built on the lie of being the self-made patriarch in his ancestral castle. The truth was simply too devastating for him to process. The day of the inspection arrived. A professional home inspector, hired by Mr. Hemlock's firm, showed up at their door at 9 a.m. sharp. My mother, according to a later, tearful phone call she made to me, was horrified. The inspector was polite but thorough, walking through the house with a clipboard and a camera, documenting everything, and he found a lot. My father, in his arrogance, had let the house fall into a state of quiet disrepair. The inspector noted the peeling paint on the upstairs window frames, the patch of water damage on the ceiling of the dining room from a slow leak in the roof, the outdated electrical wiring in the kitchen, and the furnace that was, in his professional opinion, on its last legs and a potential fire hazard. 2 days later, another letter from Hickory Lane Properties arrived. This one contained a detailed report of the inspection, complete with photos. It outlined a list of mandatory repairs that were the responsibility of the occupants, as per standard tenancy law regarding property upkeep. The estimated cost for just the most urgent repairs, the roof leak and the furnace replacement, was a staggering $25,000. The letter politely informed them that they had 60 days to complete the repairs, or they would be in breach of their tenancy agreement, which could be grounds for eviction. This was the blow that finally broke through my father's wall of denial. The demand for the monthly fee was an insult to his pride. But this was a direct threat to his financial stability. My parents lived comfortably, but they didn't have that kind of liquid cash just lying around. Their wealth was tied up in my father's now dwindling retirement portfolio and the perceived value of the house itself. The phone call I received this time wasn't from my father. It was from a panicked Eleanor. "Amelia, you have to help us," she cried, her voice thin and reedy. "This is a nightmare. They want us to pay for a new roof, a new furnace. We can't afford this. Your father, he's not taking it well. He won't even come out of his study." I let her talk, listening to the fear and confusion pour out of her. For the first time, she sounded truly vulnerable. The armor of the haughty matriarch was gone. "What does Ethan say?" I asked quietly. A long pause. He says his lawyers are looking into it, but that these trust laws are complicated," she stammered. "He says he's a bit tight on cash right now with a new investment he's made." I knew what that meant. Ethan's flashy lifestyle was a house of cards. He lived paycheck to paycheck, just with much larger paychecks and much more expensive bills. The Golden Sun, the family's financial powerhouse, was a paper tiger. He had no real wealth to fall back on. He couldn't save them. The carefully constructed world of the Hathaway family was beginning to crumble. Their power, their money, their status, it was all an illusion. And as my mother wept on the phone, begging me to figure something out, to help them, I knew the time was approaching. The foundation was cracking. The squeeze was working. They had finally been pushed into a corner they couldn't bully, intimidate, or buy their way out of. And now, with nowhere else to turn, they were finally turning to the one person they had always cast aside. They were turning to me. But they were still asking for help from Amelia, the lesser daughter. They had no idea they were about to come face to face with the owner of Hickory Lane Properties. The 60-day deadline for the repairs loomed over my parents like a guillotine. The initial panic gave way to a desperate, frantic scramble. My father, finally emerging from his study, shed his pride like a snake sheds its skin, revealing the raw, terrified man beneath. He and my mother called me daily, their conversations a rotating carousel of tactics. First came the demands, a carryover from their old way of life. "Amelia, you need to find a lawyer who can break this trust. There must be a loophole." Then came the guilt trips. "We're your parents. How can you stand by and watch us go through this?" And finally, the pleading. "We don't know what to do. We don't have the money. Please, can you help us? Just a loan. We'll pay you back, we swear." Through it all, I maintained my carefully constructed facade of the concerned but helpless daughter. I've talked to a few legal aid services, but they say these trusts are ironclad, I'd lie smoothly. I wish I could help with the money, but with Mark's salary, we just don't have that kind of savings. Each lie was a small, sharp twist of the knife, forcing them to confront the reality of the situation they had created. They had spent years devaluing my husband's profession and, by extension, our family's financial standing. Now, they were forced to accept my humble circumstances as the reason I couldn't swoop in and save them. Their own snobbery had become my most effective shield. The real drama, however, unfolded with my brother. As the pressure mounted, my parents naturally turned to their golden son, their financial wizard, the one they had always bragged about. They expected Ethan to write a check and make the problem disappear, but Ethan couldn't. What my parents didn't know, and what I had suspected for a while, was that Ethan's entire life was a leveraged performance. He had the expensive car, the designer suits, the high-powered job title, but he had no actual wealth. He lived on credit, chasing bonuses to cover the extravagant life he felt he was owed. He was a tightrope walker, and the safety net he always assumed would be there, the family estate, had just vanished. His inability to help was the single greatest blow to my parents' worldview. It shattered the central myth of our family, the myth of the brilliant, successful son and the lesser, struggling daughter. The phone call I had with Ethan during this period was a revelation. He called me late one night, his voice devoid of its usual, arrogant swagger. For the first time, he sounded scared. "I don't know what to do, Ames," he confessed, the sound of ice clinking in a glass in the background. "They think I'm made of money. I can't help them. I can barely make my own mortgage this month. This whole thing, this trust, it screwed everything up." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "The plan was always the house," he said, his voice dropping. "If things ever got really bad, I could always borrow against the house. Dad promised it would be mine someday. It was my backup, my inheritance, my inheritance." He said it with such casual, breathtaking entitlement. The house was never just a home to him. It was a financial instrument, a safety net he had factored into his reckless spending for years. The realization was sickening. He hadn't stayed close to our parents out of love or loyalty. He'd stayed close to guard his investment. This was the true breaking point. The family's financial crisis had exposed the rot at its core. My parents' favoritism wasn't just an emotional failing. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. They had banked everything, their pride, their future, their security, on a son who was a financial illusion. And they had ignored, dismissed, and alienated the one person who, by a stroke of grandfatherly genius, held all the real cards. With 2 weeks left until the deadline, the final, desperate call came. It was my father. His voice was stripped of all its usual bluster. It was the voice of a defeated man. "Amelia," he said, the words sounding foreign without the usual tone of command. "Your mother and we need to talk to you. In person. We need to ask you for a loan. Officially. We have nowhere else to turn. A loan. From me." The daughter whose husband's salary he had openly mocked. The daughter he had deemed unworthy of his legacy. The humiliation in his voice was palpable, and I felt a brief, fleeting pang of pity. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, steady resolve. This was the moment. This was the opening I had been waiting for. "Of course, Dad," I said, my voice full of a calm compassion that I knew would disarm him completely. "Why don't you, Mom, and Ethan come over to our house for dinner on Saturday? We can sit down and talk everything through, as a family." "Your house?" he asked, a hint of his old surprise in his tone. The idea of coming to my humble home as supplicants was clearly a new and uncomfortable thought. "Yes, my house," I said firmly, "Saturday at 6. I hung up the phone and walked into my living room where Mark was reading on the couch. He looked up and I just nodded. "It's time," I said. He closed his book and smiled a sad, determined smile. "Let's get the table set." We weren't just preparing for a dinner party. We were preparing for a reckoning. We were setting the stage for the final act of a drama that had been 20 years in the making. And this time, it would be performed on my home turf, under my rules. Saturday arrived under a sky the color of slate, a gray, oppressive ceiling that seemed to press down on the world, perfectly mirroring the weight in my own chest. I spent the afternoon in a flurry of deliberate, almost meditative activity. I wasn't just cooking, I was preparing a stage. I chose to roast a chicken, seasoning it with rosemary and thyme from my own small herb garden. The aroma that filled our modest home was one of comfort, of normalcy, of everything my family's grand estate was not. It was a conscious decision, a strategic move in a war that would be fought not with shouts, but with carefully chosen words and devastating truths. Every chop of a vegetable, every stir of the gravy was a small act of reclaiming my own power. This was my territory, my home. Tonight, the battle would be fought on my terms. Mark was my silent, steadfast partner in this preparation. He cleaned the house, set the dining room table with our simple, everyday dishes, and made sure the kids' rooms were tidy, even though Liam and Chloe were safely away at a sleepover. We moved around each other with an unspoken understanding. He knew the burden I was carrying, and his quiet presence was a constant reassurance that I was not alone in this. We were a united front, a fortress of two, ready to face the family that had tried for so long to fracture us. At precisely 6 o'clock, the sleek, black silhouette of my father's German luxury sedan slid into our driveway. It looked like a panther in a field of sparrows, ridiculously out of place next to our scuffed-up minivan with its faded school bumper sticker. I watched from the window as they emerged. They didn't walk up our cracked concrete path with their usual air of patrician authority. They moved like refugees seeking asylum. My father's shoulders, usually thrown back in a posture of unshakable command, were slumped. My mother's face was pale and drawn, her expensive handbag clutched in front of her like a shield. And Ethan, my golden boy brother, trailed behind them, his gaze fixed on the ground, the very picture of a prince stripped of his kingdom. I opened the door before they had a chance to knock, greeting them with a placid smile that I knew must have been unnerving. "Come on in," I said, my voice even and warm. "You're just in time. Dinner's almost ready." The meal was an excruciating masterpiece of forced civility. It was like watching a play where all the actors knew a terrible secret but were determined to pretend otherwise. My father, a man who had once openly sneered at our cozy home, now complimented the paint color in the dining room. My mother, who had always viewed my cooking with a vague air of suspicion, declared the roast chicken to be simply divine. Ethan, who could barely conceal his disdain for my husband, asked Mark a series of stilted questions about the high school football team's prospects for the season. They were performing, desperately trying to grease the wheels of a transaction, building a fragile bridge of pleasantries over a chasm of resentment, hoping I would be foolish enough to meet them in the middle. I let them. I played the part of the gracious, unsuspecting hostess. I refilled their wine glasses, offered them more potatoes, and steered the conversation toward neutral, meaningless topics. All the while, I was acutely aware of the heavy legal binder sitting on the sideboard in the adjoining living room. It was a silent, patient predator, waiting for its moment to strike. After the dinner plates were cleared and I had served coffee, we all moved into the living room. The air grew thick with unspoken anticipation. This was it. The performance was over. My mother nervously fiddled with the cuff of her silk blouse. Ethan stared intently into his coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. My father cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He still couldn't bring himself to look me in the eye, his gaze fixed on a framed finger painting Chloe had made, which hung proudly on the wall. "Amelia," he began, his voice raspy, stripped of its usual baritone authority. "Your mother and I, well, as you know, we find ourselves in a profoundly difficult situation." He paused, swallowing hard. This entity, this property management company, they are completely inflexible, We have explored every avenue. We have spoken to lawyers. We have tried to reason with them. He was still clinging to the fiction, the idea of a faceless external enemy. The repairs are non-negotiable, and the deadline is firm. We simply do not have the liquid funds to cover the cost. He finally, turned his head and met my gaze. His eyes, which had always held a look of dismissive judgment when they looked at me,